If you enjoy my channel, please give me a like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you so much.
Why I stopped smiling. Have you ever looked at your own face in the bathroom mirror at 2 o'clock in the morning and realized you have been pretending to be okay for so long that even your smile feels tired? That was me 3 years ago in the United States, standing under a bright bathroom light while the whole house was asleep, holding a cold cup of tea that I had already reheated twice because motherhood, marriage, bills, noise, and stress kept interrupting me every 7 minutes like tiny emotional pop-up ads from the universe. From the outside, my life looked surprisingly stable. I had a husband who worked hard, 2 beautiful children who loved dinosaur stickers and chocolate cereal, a small but comfortable home in a quiet American neighborhood, and shelves full of grocery store candles that made the house smell like cinnamon during winter. If someone saw my social media photos, they probably thought I was living a peaceful family life in America. Cozy kitchen, weekend barbecue, smiling kids, autumn leaves, matching sweaters at Christmas. The classic American family dream. But real life is sneaky. It hides exhaustion inside ordinary routines. Nobody posts photos of sitting in a parked car for 10 extra minutes because you are too emotionally drained to walk into your own house. Nobody uploads videos of crying quietly while folding tiny socks because your brain suddenly decides that laundry is the perfect moment to remember every insecurity you have avoided for years. And nobody warns you that living in the United States can sometimes feel emotionally confusing in ways that are hard to explain. Especially for women trying to balance family, identity, relationships, and the silent pressure to have everything together. The strange part is that nothing dramatically terrible happened to me. No giant tragedy. No movie-style disaster. Life simply became heavy one small piece at a time. Research from psychology studies in the U.S. often shows that chronic stress does not usually explode all at once. It stacks quietly through repetition. Small disappointments. Constant responsibilities. Lack of rest. Emotional isolation. Your nervous system basically becomes a phone with 50 apps running in the background until the battery starts dying at noon. That was exactly how I felt. Tired before the day even started. I remember one winter morning when my daughter spilled orange juice across the kitchen table while my son was screaming because he could not find his shoes. My husband was late for work. The dog was barking at absolutely nothing. And I suddenly forgot a simple English word during a phone call with the insurance company. One word. Just one. My brain froze. The woman on the phone politely waited, but I could feel panic climbing into my chest like a spider with caffeine addiction. In that moment, I smiled politely while speaking, but inside I felt embarrassingly small. If you live in America, you probably know this feeling. People here often smile confidently even when they are stressed, exhausted, or emotionally overwhelmed. It is part survival skill, part social culture. Americans are friendly, but they also deeply value independence and emotional control. Sometimes nobody notices you are drowning because you learned how to drown quietly. That realization scared me more than anything. I had become excellent at functioning while emotionally disconnected from myself. Every morning looked the same. Pack lunches. Clean dishes. Drive children to school. Answer messages. Buy groceries. Smile at neighbors. Repeat. My life did not look broken, but my mind felt numb. And numbness is dangerous because it does not scream. It whispers. It slowly convinces you that this tired version of yourself is permanent. One afternoon, while sitting in a grocery store parking lot in Illinois during freezing weather, I watched snow fall onto my windshield and suddenly thought, when was the last time I felt excited about my own life? That question hit harder than I expected. Not because I hated my family. I loved them deeply. But somewhere between responsibilities and routine, I disappeared from my own story. The weird thing about adulthood in America is that everybody seems busy performing stability. Clean lawns. Online meetings. Meal prep containers. Weekend shopping trips to Target. But behind many front doors, people are secretly exhausted. Especially women. Especially mothers. Especially people trying to adapt emotionally while pretending they already have everything figured out. I started noticing how many women around me apologized constantly. Sorry I'm late. Sorry the house is messy. Sorry I forgot. Sorry I look tired. It was like we were all carrying invisible pressure backpacks filled with guilt bricks. And here is something nobody explained clearly before I lived here. American culture can reward productivity so aggressively that rest sometimes feels illegal. If you slow down, your brain immediately accuses you of laziness. So instead of resting, people distract themselves. Endless scrolling. Shopping. Watching television while mentally answering tomorrow's problems. Your body sits on the couch, but your nervous system keeps running a marathon. Mine certainly did. Then something small happened that changed the direction of my entire mindset. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. One ordinary evening, my son asked me to read a children's book slowly before bedtime because he liked the calm voice. That sentence stayed in my head all night. The calm voice. I realized my children loved the version of me that moved slowly, spoke softly, and paid attention. Not the stressed version trying to complete life like a speed competition. That night, after everyone slept, I sat alone in the kitchen and quietly read a few pages from a simple English book out loud to myself. Slowly. Very slowly. Not to sound perfect. Not to impress anyone. Just to breathe. And strangely, it helped. My brain relaxed. My thoughts stopped racing for a few minutes. Scientists often explain that slow reading and slow breathing can calm the nervous system because the brain begins shifting away from survival mode. At the time, I did not care about neuroscience terminology. I only knew one thing. For the first time in months, I did not feel emotionally chased by my own life. That tiny habit became the beginning of everything that changed later. Not overnight. Not magically. Real healing is annoyingly slow. Like waiting for water to boil while somebody keeps opening the lid. But little by little, I began noticing things differently. The sound of snow outside the window. My daughter laughing at breakfast. My husband trying to help even when he was tired too. I realized discomfort was not always proof that life was failing. Sometimes discomfort was evidence that I had ignored myself for too long. And honestly, that realization was both painful and weirdly comforting at the same time. Because if exhaustion can quietly grow inside an ordinary life, maybe confidence can grow quietly too. Morning silence at home. Nobody warns you that some of the loneliest moments in marriage happen at 7 o'clock in the morning while somebody is looking for cereal and somebody else cannot find their socks. Not during dramatic arguments. Not during emotional movie scenes. Just ordinary mornings inside a perfectly normal American kitchen where the coffee machine sounds louder than your own thoughts. That was the strange part of my life in the United States. Everything looked functional from the outside, yet emotionally I felt like an actress forgetting her lines halfway through the play. One quiet Tuesday morning changed the way I understood myself forever, and honestly, it started with burnt toast. That morning the sky outside looked pale gray. The kind of winter sky that makes even happy people question their life decisions for absolutely no reason. My husband was sitting at the kitchen counter scrolling through work emails before sunrise because apparently adulthood in America means your job now lives inside your phone like an unpaid roommate. My daughter was half asleep hugging a stuffed rabbit. My son was arguing with a banana because he wanted pancakes instead. And there I was, standing in the middle of the kitchen holding a spatula like a confused game show contestant who accidentally entered the wrong studio. Everything should have felt warm, safe, familiar. But instead, the silence inside me felt enormous. Not angry silence. Not dramatic sadness. Just emotional distance. The kind that slowly appears when your brain spends too much time surviving and not enough time feeling alive. I remember looking at my family and suddenly realizing something terrifying. I had been physically present for months, but mentally absent almost the entire time. Have you ever driven somewhere and forgotten the entire trip because your brain was running internal conversations instead of paying attention? That was basically my entire life at that point. Psychologists call this autopilot behavior. The brain creates routines to conserve mental energy during stress. Helpful for avoiding saber-toothed tigers in ancient history. Slightly less helpful when you are emotionally disconnecting while loading a dishwasher in suburban America. The dangerous thing about emotional exhaustion is how normal it starts to feel. You stop asking yourself whether you are happy because survival becomes the only goal. Wake up. Handle responsibilities. Stay productive. Sleep. Repeat until Thursday somehow arrives wearing sweatpants and existential confusion. I sat down at the table that morning and noticed nobody was really talking. My husband answered emails. My kids stared at cartoons. I drank coffee that tasted suspiciously like disappointment. The television in the background kept showing smiling people advertising breakfast sandwiches as if melted cheese could solve emotional burnout. America is fascinating that way. This country can sell positivity better than almost anyone. Everywhere you look, people encourage confidence, success, self-improvement, productivity, wellness routines, vision boards, gym memberships, meal planning, skincare, mindfulness apps, and green juice that tastes like lawn clippings with ambition. Yet many people still quietly feel empty inside. Especially parents. Especially couples. Especially women carrying invisible emotional labor all day long. And emotional labor is sneaky. It means remembering school schedules, noticing low milk supplies, planning birthdays, calming tensions, organizing routines, anticipating problems. And somehow maintaining a pleasant tone while your nervous system quietly waves a tiny white surrender flag in the background. Scientists studying stress often explain that the human brain struggles when recovery time disappears. Without moments of mental rest, cortisol levels remain elevated, attention weakens, and emotional regulation becomes harder. Which is a very scientific way of saying your brain eventually starts reacting to spilled juice like it personally betrayed your ancestors. Mine definitely did. That morning, after the kids left for school, I stood in the suddenly quiet kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum like an awkward conversation starter. The house finally became silent, but instead of feeling peaceful, it felt heavy. I realized I had spent months avoiding silence because silence gave my thoughts enough room to speak honestly. And honestly? My thoughts were exhausted. I kept asking myself strange questions. When did I stop laughing naturally? Why did simple tasks feel emotionally expensive? Why did every day feel rushed even when nothing catastrophic was happening? Then something small caught my attention. A yellow sticky note on the refrigerator written by my daughter in messy handwriting. Mom, thank you for breakfast. That was it. 5 simple words. Tiny crooked letters. But my chest tightened immediately because I suddenly realized my children were still noticing love in moments where I only noticed stress. That hit me harder than I expected. You see, when people become overwhelmed, the brain develops what psychologists call negativity bias. Your attention automatically focuses more on problems than positive experiences because survival systems prioritize danger detection. Helpful for ancient cave people. Extremely annoying for modern parents standing beside organic yogurt in Costco wondering why life feels emotionally blurry. I started thinking about how often adults wait for giant life changes before allowing themselves to feel hopeful again. We imagine confidence arrives dramatically. New job. New house. Huge transformation montage with inspirational music. But real emotional healing usually enters quietly. Through tiny habits. Tiny observations. Tiny pauses. That morning, instead of rushing to clean the kitchen immediately, I sat by the window for 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing productive. Honestly, at first it felt illegal. My brain kept yelling invisible instructions. Fold laundry. Check messages. Organize closet. Learn a new skill. Become a better mother by noon somehow. But slowly, my breathing calmed down. I watched snow fall across the street while one neighbor struggled heroically with recycling bins that clearly hated him personally. And for the first time in a long time, I noticed something important about American life that many people never openly discuss. Everything here moves fast. Fast conversations. Fast food. Fast schedules. Fast expectations. Even self-improvement becomes competitive. People are constantly trying to optimize themselves like confused little robots with emotional support coffee cups. No wonder so many people secretly feel overwhelmed. My nervous system had adapted to speed so completely that slowing down felt uncomfortable. But discomfort is not always a warning sign. Sometimes it is proof your brain is adjusting to something healthier. Around that time, I started practicing something embarrassingly simple every evening after dinner. I would sit quietly and read slow English stories out loud for 10 or 15 minutes. Nothing advanced. Nothing impressive. Just calm reading. Simple words. Gentle pacing. At first, I only wanted to improve my speaking confidence a little. But unexpectedly, it became emotional therapy. Reading slowly forced my brain to stop racing ahead. My breathing slowed naturally. My thoughts became less chaotic. Research actually shows that slow reading and rhythmic speech can activate relaxation responses in the nervous system. Again, science has fancy terminology for everything. Personally, I just felt like my brain finally removed tight shoes after walking too long. One night my husband noticed the change before I did. He looked at me while washing dishes and said, you seem calmer lately." That sentence almost made me cry because I realized I had been emotionally surviving for so long that calmness itself now felt unfamiliar. And maybe that is the real danger of modern life. Not dramatic failure. Not giant disasters. Just slowly forgetting what peace feels like while trying to become efficient at everything else. That quiet morning in my kitchen taught me something I still remember today. Sometimes confidence does not begin with motivation. Sometimes it begins with finally sitting still long enough to hear your own exhausted heart asking for help. The grocery store lesson. There is something strangely humbling about standing in the middle of an American grocery store holding the wrong kind of yogurt while questioning your entire life direction. Not your career. Not your marriage. Your actual existence. That was me on a freezing Friday evening in February, wearing an oversized winter coat. Pushing a shopping cart with one squeaky wheel that sounded like a dying seagull every time I turned left. My children were arguing about cookies. My husband was texting me 3 different brands of pasta sauce he forgot to mention earlier. And somewhere between the frozen pizza aisle and the organic almond milk section, I accidentally learned one of the most important lessons about living in the United States. And oddly enough, it had almost nothing to do with groceries. You see, grocery stores in America are not just places where people buy food. They are emotional obstacle courses disguised as fluorescent lighting. Everybody looks busy. Everybody walks fast. Everybody pretends they know exactly which bread contains fewer chemicals and more spiritual enlightenment. Meanwhile, I was standing there comparing cereal boxes like my future happiness depended on fiber content. But that evening something happened that stayed in my mind for months afterward. I was reaching for a carton of eggs when I noticed an older woman nearby struggling to grab something from the top shelf. Instinctively, I stepped closer and lightly touched her shopping cart while trying to help. Immediately her face changed. Not angry exactly. Just uncomfortable. She politely smiled and stepped back slightly before saying, "Oh, thank you, but I'm okay." Her voice stayed calm, but I instantly realized I had crossed an invisible line without meaning to. In many cultures, physical closeness during small interactions feels normal. Friendly even. But in America, especially in public spaces, personal boundaries are treated almost like sacred national monuments. People deeply value personal space, independence, and privacy. Nobody had clearly explained that to me before. It sounds small, but these tiny cultural differences quietly shape everyday life in the United States. And if you do not understand them, you can accidentally feel rejected when nobody intended to reject you at all. I remember walking away from that moment feeling weirdly embarrassed. My brain immediately started replaying the interaction like a low-budget documentary narrated by insecurity. Did I make her uncomfortable? Did I seem rude? Why did such a tiny situation suddenly feel emotionally huge? That is the exhausting thing about living with constant self-awareness. Your brain turns ordinary moments into courtroom trials where you are somehow both the lawyer and the criminal. Psychologists often explain that people experiencing stress or social anxiety tend to overanalyze neutral interactions because the nervous system stays alert for possible rejection, which is fascinating scientifically and absolutely annoying emotionally. My brain could transform one awkward grocery store interaction into a 3-day emotional Netflix series called Why Are You Like This? But here is where the story becomes interesting. About 10 minutes later, while I was standing near the self-checkout area pretending I understood coupons, the same older woman approached me again. This time she smiled warmly and said, "You're very kind. Some people here just really value personal space." That one sentence changed everything. Because suddenly I understood something important about American culture that many people misunderstand completely. Distance does not always mean dislike. Quietness does not always mean coldness. Independence does not always mean emotional disconnection. In the United States, respecting boundaries is often considered a form of kindness. People may smile less dramatically than in some cultures, but they often show respect by giving others freedom, space, and privacy. Once I realized that, so many confusing experiences from previous years suddenly made sense. The neighbors who waved politely but never entered my house unexpectedly. Parents who scheduled playdates weeks in advance like tiny business meetings. Friends who said we should get coffee sometime without necessarily planning actual coffee. At first, I interpreted these behaviors as emotional distance. But slowly I realized they were simply different social rhythms. And honestly, understanding those rhythms made life feel less personally painful. That grocery store evening also taught me something uncomfortable about myself. I had been measuring my worth based on how smoothly I blended into every situation. If conversations felt awkward, I blamed myself. If cultural differences appeared, I assumed I was failing somehow. But maybe growth does not happen when you perfectly avoid discomfort. Maybe growth happens when you stop treating every uncomfortable moment like evidence of personal failure. Around that time, I became obsessed with observing small American habits. Not critically. Curiously. I noticed how cashiers often used cheerful small talk even when exhausted. I noticed people apologizing for bumping shopping carts from 6 feet away like emotional ninjas. I noticed parents calmly giving children choices instead of constant commands. Would you like the blue jacket or the red one? Tiny details. But these details quietly reveal deeper values inside a culture. Independence. Personal preference. Emotional boundaries. Individual choice. The funny thing is that the more I stopped judging these differences, the more relaxed I became emotionally. Neuroscience research often shows that curiosity reduces fear responses in the brain. When people shift from judgment to observation, stress levels can decrease because the brain stops interpreting differences as threats. Again, science always finds complicated ways to describe things grandmothers already knew. Stay curious and you suffer less. Simple. That night after returning home, I unloaded groceries while my children chased each other through the kitchen like caffeinated squirrels. My husband accidentally dropped a jar of pasta sauce, which exploded dramatically across the floor because apparently spaghetti ingredients enjoy chaos. Normally I would have become instantly overwhelmed. But instead, I laughed. Actual real laughter. Not the fake polite survival laugh adults use during stressful situations. Something about that grocery store experience softened me mentally. I realized I had spent too much energy trying to avoid awkwardness instead of learning from it. And honestly, awkwardness is basically adulthood's permanent roommate anyway. Nobody truly knows what they are doing. Some people are simply more confident while being confused. Later that evening, after everyone slept, I sat quietly reading simple English passages out loud again. Slowly. Calmly. I noticed that when I stopped rushing through words, I also stopped rushing through emotions. My mind felt clearer. Less defensive. More patient. That became one of the biggest turning points in my emotional healing journey inside the United States. Not because my life suddenly became easy, but because I finally stopped expecting myself to navigate every cultural situation perfectly. Perfection is exhausting. Awareness is lighter. There is a massive difference. Looking back now, it is funny that one tiny grocery store interaction taught me more about confidence than any motivational speech ever could. Confidence is not knowing all the rules. Confidence is surviving moments where you realize you do not know the rules and continuing anyway. And honestly, that squeaky shopping cart probably understood my emotional state better than most people did. I almost stopped talking. There is a very specific kind of embarrassment that happens when your brain knows exactly what you want to say in English. But your mouth suddenly behaves like it lost internet connection. If you have ever forgotten a simple word while someone waits politely in front of you, then you already understand the strange panic I am talking about. Your heartbeat speeds up. Your face becomes warm. Your thoughts scatter like frightened pigeons. And somehow the English you practiced perfectly at home disappears into another dimension the moment a real human being appears. That was becoming my daily reality in the United States, and eventually I started avoiding conversations altogether. Not because I hated English. Not because I was lazy. I was simply tired of feeling mentally clumsy in situations that looked effortless for everyone else. The strange thing is that nobody around me was cruel. Americans were usually patient. Friendly even. But anxiety does not need actual danger to survive. It creates imaginary danger beautifully on its own. One afternoon I went to pick up my son from school. And a teacher stopped me near the entrance to ask a simple question about an upcoming parent event. Simple question. Simple conversation. Completely normal. Yet my brain reacted like somebody had suddenly thrown me into a live television interview without warning. The teacher spoke quickly, smiling politely, while children screamed in the background and parents walked everywhere carrying backpacks, water bottles, jackets, and the emotional energy of absolute chaos. I understood maybe 70% of what she said. Enough to survive. Not enough to feel confident. So I smiled awkwardly, answered too fast, and accidentally mixed up two words that completely changed the meaning of my sentence. The teacher looked confused for one tiny second before correcting me gently. Tiny moment. Probably forgotten by her immediately. But my brain? Oh, my brain preserved that memory like an Oscar-winning emotional disaster. That evening I replayed the conversation repeatedly while cooking dinner. Why did I say that? Why do I still sound nervous? Why can't I speak naturally yet? The problem was not English anymore. The problem was shame. And shame is dangerous because it quietly convinces people to shrink themselves. Psychologists explain that repeated social anxiety can trigger avoidance behaviors. The brain associates speaking with emotional discomfort, so it starts encouraging silence as protection. Basically, your nervous system becomes an overprotective parent screaming, "Do not touch the stove again." Even when the stove is not actually dangerous. That is exactly what happened to me. I began choosing self-checkout machines instead of cashiers. I avoided phone calls whenever possible. I let my husband handle conversations that I could have managed myself. And little by little, my confidence disappeared so gradually that I barely noticed it happening. The ironic part? My English was actually improving. I could understand movies better. I could read books more comfortably. But emotionally, I still felt insecure because confidence and skill are not always the same thing. You can know enough English and still feel terrified speaking it. One rainy Thursday changed everything for me. My daughter had a dentist appointment, and my husband could not come because of work. So there I was, sitting inside a brightly lit dental office that smelled aggressively like mint and expensive insurance paperwork. The receptionist spoke quickly while asking me to update forms on a digital tablet that looked more technologically advanced than my emotional stability. Halfway through the conversation, I misunderstood an important question about medical history and answered incorrectly. The receptionist politely corrected me, but suddenly I felt that familiar wave of panic rising again. My chest tightened. My thoughts blurred. And for one ridiculous moment, I wanted to cry in a dentist office lobby because of paperwork. Adulthood is glamorous sometimes. Then something unexpected happened. An older American woman sitting nearby leaned toward me and quietly said, "Take your time. Nobody here is rushing you." That sentence hit me harder than she probably realized. Nobody here is rushing you. I repeated those words in my head all evening because they exposed something important about my mental state. The pressure I felt was not always coming from other people. Much of it came from myself. I had created impossible expectations inside my own mind. Speak perfectly. Respond quickly. Never make mistakes. Sound confident immediately. Honestly, my nervous system deserved an apology letter. Neuroscience studies often show that the brain struggles to process language efficiently under stress because anxiety activates survival systems instead of learning systems. In simple words, panic makes your brain temporarily dumber. Which explains why intelligent adults suddenly forget words like spoon during stressful conversations. My problem was not intelligence. My problem was fear. And fear loves speed. Fear rushes you. Fear tells you silence is safer than embarrassment. Fear convinces you that mistakes are proof of failure instead of proof that you are learning. That night, after my children slept, I sat alone at the kitchen table listening to rain tap softly against the windows. Instead of scrolling through social media or distracting myself with television, I opened a simple English reading book and started reading out loud slowly. Very slowly. At first it felt awkward. My pronunciation was not perfect. My voice sounded tired. But something interesting happened after a few minutes. My breathing relaxed. My shoulders loosened. My thoughts stopped attacking me constantly. Reading slowly forced me to stay present instead of mentally racing ahead toward imaginary embarrassment. Scientists studying language learning often explain that slow repetition strengthens neural pathways and improves confidence because the brain begins associating language with calm experiences instead of stressful ones. Again, science always sounds fancy, but honestly it just felt like my brain finally unclenched its fists. So I created a strange little nightly routine. Every evening after dinner, I practiced slow English reading for 15 minutes. No pressure. No perfection. Sometimes children's stories. Sometimes simple life articles. Sometimes short emotional passages that felt comforting. I focused less on sounding impressive and more on sounding calm. And gradually, something surprising changed. My speaking improved naturally because my fear slowly weakened. One morning at a coffee shop, the barista accidentally gave me the wrong drink. Normally I would have stayed silent and accepted my emotional support disappointment latte. But this time I calmly explained the mistake in English without panic. Tiny moment. Yet afterward I sat in my car feeling absurdly proud of myself over coffee correction skills, like I had just negotiated world peace. That is the funny thing about rebuilding confidence. The victories look ridiculously small at first. But small victories retrain the brain. Slowly your nervous system realizes conversations are not life-threatening events. People are not secretly grading your existence. Most adults are too busy worrying about themselves anyway. Looking back now, I realize I almost stopped talking because I confused discomfort with incapability. But discomfort is not evidence that you are failing. Sometimes discomfort is simply your brain stretching beyond old fears. And honestly, if my anxious nervous system could survive dentist office paperwork in America, there was probably hope for everything else too. The older woman next door. Sometimes the people who change your life do not arrive dramatically. No emotional movie soundtrack. No inspirational speech under the rain. Sometimes they appear wearing oversized gardening gloves and yelling at squirrels from across the yard like tiny criminals stealing tomatoes. That was exactly how I met Eleanor, the older woman living next door to our house in the United States. The first thing I noticed about her was not kindness. It was volume. Every morning around 8 o'clock, she opened her back door and spoke to birds, plants, and neighborhood cats with the confidence of somebody who had completely stopped caring whether society considered her strange. Honestly, I admired that immediately. At the time, my life still felt emotionally heavy. I was speaking English more often than before, but inside I remained cautious all the time. Careful with words. Careful with social situations. Careful with emotions. My brain treated every interaction like a dangerous balance beam performance where one wrong move could send me crashing into humiliation. Meanwhile, Eleanor walked through life wearing bright purple rain boots and greeting strangers like an enthusiastic weather reporter. She confused me deeply. One afternoon during early spring, I was outside trying unsuccessfully to help my son ride his bicycle without training wheels. By helping, I mostly mean emotionally panicking while he rode directly toward mailboxes with the confidence of a tiny stuntman. Suddenly Eleanor appeared beside her fence holding a watering can and said, "Honey, if kids never fall down, they grow up scared of sidewalks." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the bicycle. That sentence stayed in my mind all evening because somehow it described much more than parenting. Maybe adults work the same way. Maybe emotional confidence also requires falling awkwardly a few times. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and I started having small conversations outside. Nothing dramatic at first. Weather comments. Gardening complaints. Discussions about how American supermarkets somehow sell 47 different types of yogurt while still making shopping emotionally exhausting. But slowly, I noticed something fascinating about her. Eleanor listened differently than most people. She never rushed conversations. Never interrupted nervously. Never looked distracted. In America, many conversations move quickly because everyone secretly feels busy all the time. But Eleanor spoke slowly, thoughtfully, like somebody who understood that calmness itself is a form of intelligence. One evening while my children played outside, she asked me a simple question. "Why do you always apologize before speaking?" That sentence hit me like a tiny emotional brick. Because she was right. I constantly apologized. Sorry, my English is not perfect. Sorry, maybe this sounds strange. Sorry, I talk too slowly. I had become so afraid of judgment that I apologized for existing before conversations even began. Eleanor looked at me for a moment and said something I still remember perfectly. Confident people are not people who never feel awkward. They are people who stop treating awkwardness like an emergency. Honestly, my brain needed several business days to process that sentence. Because until then, I believed confidence meant smoothness. Fast answers. Perfect pronunciation. No mistakes. But Eleanor carried herself differently. She forgot words sometimes. Repeated stories. Mispronounced technology terms hilariously. Once she accidentally called Wi-Fi the invisible internet air. Yet somehow none of those things damaged her confidence because she simply did not assign emotional catastrophe to ordinary imperfection. Psychologists often explain that socially confident people are not necessarily less awkward than anxious people. They simply recover faster from discomfort because they do not overinterpret mistakes as threats to their identity. In other words, confident people experience embarrassment and move on. Anxious people experience embarrassment and mentally create a 10-episode documentary about it afterward. Guess which category I belonged to? Around that time, Eleanor began inviting me over occasionally for tea in her living room, which looked exactly like the inside of a very emotional antique store. Floral pillows. Old books. Lamps that probably survived multiple decades and at least one historical crisis. Somehow the entire room smelled like cinnamon and patience. During one conversation, she told me something surprising about life in the United States. Most Americans are lonelier than they admit, she said quietly. People here value independence so much that sometimes they forget humans still need connection. That explained so many things I had observed for years. The polite distance. The emotional privacy. The way neighbors smiled warmly but rarely discussed deeper feelings. America is friendly in many ways, but emotional vulnerability often stays hidden beneath productivity and routines. Eleanor believed modern adults were emotionally overstimulated and spiritually exhausted. Honestly, after raising children, managing responsibilities, and surviving grocery store self-checkout machines, I agreed completely. One rainy afternoon changed our friendship forever. I arrived at her house looking emotionally drained after a difficult argument with my husband about schedules, finances, and parenting stress. Nothing dramatic. Just two exhausted adults accidentally throwing frustration at each other like emotional dodgeballs. I sat at Eleanor's kitchen table trying not to cry while explaining everything too quickly in nervous English. When I finally stopped talking, she quietly handed me tea and asked, "When was the last time you rested without guilt?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I genuinely did not know. Rest without guilt. That concept sounded almost illegal. Especially as a mother. Especially in American culture where busyness often becomes a strange form of social status. People proudly announce exhaustion like competitive athletes. I only slept 4 hours. I worked all weekend. I'm so busy lately. Meanwhile, nervous systems everywhere are basically filing emotional complaints. Neuroscience research often shows that chronic stress affects emotional regulation, memory, communication, and even physical health. Yet modern adults frequently treat exhaustion like proof of responsibility instead of a warning sign. Eleanor understood this instinctively. She told me something I will never forget. Your mind cannot heal in the same environment where it constantly feels rushed. That night after returning home, I sat quietly in the kitchen thinking about everything she said. Then I opened one of my slow English reading books again and began reading aloud softly to myself. I noticed that these calm reading sessions no longer felt like language practice anymore. They felt like emotional breathing space. My thoughts slowed down. My chest felt lighter. Even my children noticed changes in me. I smiled more naturally. I reacted less aggressively during stressful moments. I listened more carefully instead of mentally rushing ahead toward the next responsibility. Scientists studying mindfulness and language repetition often explain that slow rhythmic reading can reduce anxiety because it anchors attention in the present moment. Personally, I just felt human again. Weeks later, while watching my son ride his bicycle more confidently down the sidewalk, I suddenly understood what Eleanor meant from the beginning. Falling is not the opposite of growth. Falling is usually part of growth. Children learn balance by wobbling. Adults learn confidence the exact same way. Awkward conversations. Emotional mistakes. Difficult seasons. Embarrassing moments. None of these things prove you are failing at life. They prove you are still participating in it. And honestly, if a 70-year-old woman wearing purple rain boots could teach me emotional resilience beside tomato plants in suburban America, maybe healing really can arrive in the strangest possible forms. Dinner table culture shock. Nobody prepares you for how emotionally confusing dinner tables can become after marriage. Not the food itself. Honestly, food is usually the easiest part. The real confusion begins with silence, timing, eye contact, parenting styles, and the strange invisible rules families carry without realizing it. I discovered this slowly during everyday life in America. Usually around 6:30 in the evening while somebody spilled milk and somebody else argued about vegetables like tiny exhausted politicians. From the outside, our family dinners looked normal. Warm kitchen lights. Plates clattering softly. Children laughing sometimes. My husband discussing work stories while checking tomorrow's weather on his phone because apparently American adults treat weather forecasts like national security information. Yet underneath those ordinary moments, I constantly felt like I was translating invisible emotional languages that nobody had formally taught me. The strangest part was realizing that cultural differences inside marriage are often quiet, not dramatic. They hide in tiny routines, tiny reactions, tiny expectations. One evening changed the way I understood all of this forever. It started with broccoli, which honestly feels disrespectful because no emotional breakthrough should begin with broccoli. My daughter refused to eat vegetables. My son was making dinosaur noises instead of answering questions. And I finally snapped in frustration after repeating myself 6 different times. My voice became sharp. Not screaming exactly, but tense enough that the entire table suddenly fell silent. My husband looked at me carefully before calmly saying, "Hey, maybe let them calm down first." That sentence should not have felt offensive. But emotionally, it hit me like criticism. Immediately my brain reacted defensively. Why am I always the strict parent? Why do I suddenly sound like the angry person in this family? Why does everyone else seem calm while I feel overwhelmed all the time? The rest of dinner became painfully awkward. My children stayed quiet. My husband spoke softly. And I sat there chewing broccoli while internally questioning my personality, parenting skills, emotional stability, and possibly my entire ancestral bloodline. Adulthood is incredibly dramatic internally for no reason sometimes. Later that night, after the children slept, my husband gently explained something I had never fully noticed before. In many American families, especially modern households, parents often try to avoid emotionally intense reactions during small conflicts. Instead of immediate correction, they use redirection, choices, calm explanation, or temporary space. Not because they are passive. Because culturally, emotional regulation is highly valued. Listening to him, I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. I grew up believing good parenting meant constant correction and responsibility. But here in the United States, many families emphasized emotional communication just as much as discipline. Neither approach was completely right or wrong. Just different. And honestly, understanding differences inside marriage is much harder than understanding differences at grocery stores because emotional expectations feel personal. Very personal. Psychologists often explain that couples from different backgrounds frequently argue not because they lack love, but because they interpret behavior differently. One person sees calmness as respect. Another sees calmness as emotional distance. One person sees direct correction as responsibility. Another experiences it as criticism. Suddenly tiny misunderstandings become emotional earthquakes because both people secretly believe their habits are normal. Looking back now, I realize I spent too much time assuming my husband naturally understood the emotional meaning behind my reactions. But humans are not mind readers. Honestly, most adults barely understand their own emotions half the time. A few days after the broccoli incident, something else happened that quietly changed me. We attended a neighborhood family barbecue where several American parents sat casually while children made gigantic messes nearby with ketchup, juice boxes, and what looked suspiciously like melted popsicles on patio furniture. I kept waiting for somebody to panic dramatically. Nobody did. Parents corrected behavior calmly, but without the emotional intensity one was used to expecting. At one point a little boy accidentally dropped an entire plate of chips across the grass. His mother laughed softly and said, "Well, the ants are having a great day." That moment genuinely confused me. If that happened in my childhood, somebody's nervous system would have exploded immediately. But here was this woman treating disaster like a mildly inconvenient weather update. That barbecue became an accidental psychology lesson for me. I started observing how many American families prioritize emotional safety during communication. Not perfection. Not control. Emotional safety. Children are encouraged to express feelings openly. Couples often discuss boundaries directly. Parents apologize to children when wrong. At first, this felt unfamiliar to me. Even uncomfortable. But slowly I began noticing how calm environments affected my own nervous system too. Around that period, my nightly slow English reading routine continued helping me emotionally in ways I never expected. I started reading short stories about relationships, family life, emotions, and communication. Slowly. Quietly. The slower I read, the more clearly I noticed emotional patterns inside myself. Scientists studying emotional regulation often explain that slower speech and slower breathing can help reduce reactive stress responses because the nervous system exits survival mode. Which basically means your brain becomes less likely to emotionally wrestle somebody over broccoli. Very important scientific advancement. One rainy evening after dinner, my husband and I finally had an honest conversation about exhaustion. Real conversation. Not logistical planning disguised as communication. We talked about parenting stress, emotional pressure, work fatigue, and how easy it is for couples to become teammates managing chaos instead of partners actually connecting. At one point he admitted something surprising. Sometimes I don't know when you need comfort and when you need solutions. That sentence stayed with me because honestly, I did not always know either. Many women silently carry emotional overload for so long that frustration eventually leaks out sideways through small moments. Tone of voice. Irritation. Exhaustion disguised as anger. Neuroscience research shows that chronic stress reduces patience and increases emotional reactivity because the brain remains in heightened alert mode. Which explains why tired adults sometimes argue about dishes like international diplomats negotiating peace treaties. Slowly, our dinners began changing. Not magically. Real family change is awkward and inconsistent. Some evenings still felt chaotic. Children still fought over ridiculous things. My husband still forgot groceries occasionally despite written lists existing for centuries. But emotionally, something softened between us. I became less defensive. He became more attentive. We both stopped treating every misunderstanding like proof the relationship was failing. One tiny habit helped unexpectedly. During dinner, we started asking slower questions instead of fast practical ones. Not did you finish homework, but what made you laugh today? Not what's tomorrow's schedule, but what felt difficult today. Simple changes. Yet the atmosphere shifted completely. The house felt warmer emotionally. Safer somehow. Looking back now, I realize my biggest culture shock in America was never language, weather, or food. It was discovering how deeply emotional habits shape family life. Some people inherit loud communication. Some inherit silence. Some inherit criticism disguised as care. Others inherit emotional openness. But nobody automatically teaches adults how to unlearn stressful patterns. That process takes awareness, patience, and honestly, many uncomfortable conversations near overcooked vegetables. The beautiful thing is this, families do not need to become perfect to become healthier. Sometimes healing begins the moment people stop trying to win every emotional moment and start trying to understand each other instead. And surprisingly, my children probably learned that lesson long before I did. Love feels different here. Nobody tells you that love can sound completely different depending on the country, the family, and the emotional habits people grow up with. Before living this life in America, I secretly believed love was supposed to feel obvious all the time. Big emotional conversations. Constant reassurance. Clear affection. The kind of romance movies sell with dramatic music and suspiciously perfect lighting. But real marriage inside ordinary American life looked nothing like that. Real love here often looked quiet. Exhausted. Practical. Hidden inside tiny daily actions so small they were easy to miss unless you slowed down enough to notice them. And honestly, for a long time, I almost missed all of it. One cold Sunday morning changed the way I understood love forever. Not because something dramatic happened. Actually, the entire moment involved pancakes, wet socks, and a broken washing machine. Which feels emotionally unfair somehow. That morning the house was chaotic from the beginning. My daughter spilled syrup on the floor. My son refused to wear matching shoes because apparently children enjoy psychological warfare before breakfast. The washing machine suddenly stopped working mid-cycle, leaving wet clothes trapped inside like emotional hostages. Meanwhile, I stood in the kitchen already exhausted before 10 o'clock in the morning, wondering if adulthood was simply a very long group project. Nobody remembered joining. My husband walked into the laundry room, looked at the broken machine quietly for a few seconds, and without saying much, started fixing it while simultaneously helping the kids eat breakfast. No dramatic speech. No heroic movie energy. Just calm problem solving while wearing old sweatpants and looking half awake. At first I barely noticed it because my brain was too busy focusing on stress. But later that evening, something strange happened. Eleanor, my older neighbor with the purple rain boots and mysterious emotional wisdom, casually asked me, "How does your husband show love?" I immediately answered with things he used to say years ago. Compliments. Sweet messages. Romantic conversations. Eleanor listened patiently before smiling and saying, "No, honey, I asked how he shows love now." That sentence hit me like emotional lightning wrapped in grandma energy. Because suddenly I realized I had been measuring love using outdated expectations while completely ignoring the quieter forms already surrounding me. Every day. In American family culture, especially after years of marriage and children, love often becomes deeply practical. Packing lunches. Refilling the car with gas. Remembering your favorite snacks at the grocery store. Sitting beside you silently after a hard day. Folding laundry when you are too tired. These actions may not look cinematic, but psychologically they matter enormously. Researchers studying long-term relationships often explain that emotional security grows less from dramatic romance and more from consistent small behaviors. Tiny moments of reliability train the nervous system to feel safe. And honestly, safety becomes incredibly attractive once adulthood starts throwing bills, stress, responsibilities, and random school emails at your face every week. Looking back now, I realize part of my loneliness came from misunderstanding emotional expression inside American life. Many people here grow up learning to show care through independence and helpfulness rather than constant emotional intensity. At first, that style confused me deeply. Sometimes I interpreted quietness as distance. Practical support as lack of passion. But slowly I began seeing the hidden tenderness underneath ordinary routines. One evening my husband came home late from work after a stressful day. I expected him to immediately sit down and relax. Instead, he quietly noticed I looked overwhelmed and started washing dishes without saying anything. The kitchen stayed silent except for running water and children laughing upstairs. And suddenly I felt emotional for no logical reason at all. Because in that moment, I realized love is not always loud enough for social media. Sometimes love looks like somebody noticing your exhaustion before you even mention it. Psychologists often explain that healthy relationships depend heavily on emotional attunement. That means recognizing each other's stress, moods, and emotional needs through small observations. Humans feel safer when they sense that someone notices their internal world. Which sounds beautifully scientific. But honestly, it sometimes just means somebody bringing you tea without being asked because your face already looks emotionally defeated. Around this period, my slow English reading habit became strangely connected to my marriage too. Every night after the children slept, I spent 15 or 20 minutes reading simple emotional stories out loud quietly. Sometimes my husband sat nearby working on his laptop while listening absent-mindedly. One night he suddenly said, "Your voice sounds peaceful lately." That comment stayed in my mind for days because I realized something important. For years, stress had changed the emotional atmosphere of our home without me noticing. I spoke too quickly, reacted too sharply, rushed through everything. My nervous system constantly behaved like it was late for an invisible emergency. But slowing down changed more than my English confidence. It changed the emotional temperature around my family too. Neuroscience research often shows that emotional states spread socially through tone of voice, facial expressions, and nervous system responses. Calm people literally help calm other people biologically. Which means exhausted adults accidentally transmit stress like Wi-Fi signals. Very romantic information for married couples everywhere. One rainy night after putting the children to bed, my husband and I sat quietly on the couch watching a terrible home renovation show where everybody somehow destroys entire kitchens while smiling aggressively. Halfway through the episode, he casually reached over and fixed a loose strand of hair behind my ear while continuing to watch television. Tiny gesture. Barely noticeable. But my chest tightened unexpectedly because I realized something embarrassing. I had spent so much time searching for giant emotional reassurance that I ignored dozens of small loving moments happening constantly around me. The problem was not absence of love. The problem was emotional speed. I was moving too fast internally to recognize tenderness while it quietly passed by. That realization changed how I viewed relationships completely. Modern life in America often teaches people to chase excitement endlessly. Bigger emotions. Bigger achievements. Bigger transformations. But stable love rarely feels dramatic every single day. Sometimes stable love feels ordinary. Comfortable. Quiet. Like somebody remembering how you take your coffee after 10 years together. And honestly, there is something deeply healing about being loved in ordinary ways after spending so much time emotionally overwhelmed. Of course, marriage still remained difficult sometimes. We still argued. Still misunderstood each other occasionally. Still became stressed by parenting, finances, and exhaustion. But emotionally, I stopped expecting love to rescue me dramatically from discomfort. Instead, I started recognizing how love quietly supports people while they slowly rescue themselves too. Looking back now, I think many adults secretly miss love because they only search for fireworks while ignoring candles already glowing softly beside them. Real connection often hides inside repetitive routines. Shared exhaustion. Tiny kindnesses. Gentle patience during difficult seasons. And strangely enough, once I stopped demanding that love constantly feel exciting, I finally started feeling loved much more deeply than before. Maybe that is the strange beauty of long-term relationships in ordinary American life. Romance does not disappear. It simply changes clothes and starts carrying groceries. The night I broke down. There are nights that look completely ordinary on the outside but quietly split your life into before and after versions. And for me it was one of those American winter evenings where everything felt too normal to suspect anything emotional was about to happen. The kids were finally asleep upstairs after a long day of school, snacks, arguments about toys, and the usual chaos that makes parenting feel like running a small emotional startup without funding or breaks. My husband and I were in the kitchen cleaning up dinner. Doing that silent teamwork routine couples fall into when they are too tired to talk but still functioning as a unit, plates clinking softly. Water running, fridge humming like it had opinions about our life choices, and I remember thinking this is what adulthood looks like in America. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just repetitive responsibility wrapped in exhaustion. The argument started over something so small it almost feels embarrassing to admit now. Something about scheduling and forgotten tasks and mental overload. The kind of conversation that would normally pass like a cloud if both people were well rested, but that night I was not well rested. I was emotionally full in the worst possible way, the kind of full where even one more word feels like the final drop that breaks everything. I remember my voice changing first, not louder exactly, but sharper, more tired than angry. And my husband paused mid-sentence like he suddenly realized we were no longer talking about dishes or calendars but something deeper neither of us had properly named yet. In American family life, especially with kids and work pressure, communication often becomes functional instead of emotional. You talk to solve problems, you plan logistics, you divide responsibilities, but you forget to check what is happening inside each other's minds. And that gap slowly grows without warning. I felt that gap fully that night. I remember standing by the counter holding a towel too tightly, like if I loosened my grip I might fall apart. And suddenly everything I had been carrying for months came rushing up at once, not just the argument but everything behind it, the constant thinking. The constant adjusting, the silent pressure of being a mother, a wife, a communicator. Someone who had to translate not only language but emotions across two cultures and two ways of seeing life. My husband said something gentle again, trying to calm the moment, but instead of calming me, it triggered something deeper. Because my brain interpreted calmness as dismissal, as if my feelings were being minimized. And that is the dangerous part of emotional exhaustion. It changes how you interpret even kindness. I remember laughing once, not because anything was funny, but because my nervous system was overloaded and did not know what else to do. And that laugh quickly turned into tears, the kind you cannot control, the kind that arrives before your thoughts can organize themselves. I turned away so he would not see me fully breaking down, but in a small kitchen in a quiet American neighborhood, there is nowhere really to hide. Everything echoes, even silence. I ended up sitting on the floor, something I had not done in years. Just sitting there between the fridge and the cabinet like my body had finally decided it was done pretending to be strong. And I remember thinking this is ridiculous. Adults are not supposed to fall apart on kitchen floors over dishes and schedules. But at the same time it was the most honest moment I had experienced in a long while. My husband eventually sat down next to me, not speaking at first, just present, and that silence felt different from earlier silence in our marriage. This one was not avoidance, it was waiting, and I did not realize how important that difference was until later. Psychologists often explain that emotional breakdowns in long-term relationships are rarely about one specific event. They are usually about accumulated stress that finally exceeds the nervous system's ability to regulate, and I felt that in my bones that night. Like my entire system had been running too long without maintenance. I finally said something I had been holding inside for months, not perfectly, not clearly, but honestly. I told him I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix, tired in a way that made normal life feel heavier than it should, and the moment I said it, something inside me shifted slightly, not fixed, not healed, but acknowledged. He listened, really listened. And that alone felt strange because I was not used to being fully heard without interruption or solution immediately offered. In many American relationships, especially ones balancing work, parenting, and stress, people often default to problem solving instead of emotional witnessing, meaning they try to fix instead of first understanding. And that night I realized I needed understanding more than solutions. I also realized something uncomfortable about myself. I had been trying to be strong in a way that left no room for vulnerability. And strength without vulnerability slowly turns into pressure, like holding your breath for too long without noticing. After that night, nothing magically changed immediately. Life did not suddenly become easy or organized. The kids still needed care. Work still existed, bills still arrived, but something subtle changed inside how we approached each other. There was more pause before reacting. More questions instead of assumptions. More willingness to say I am overwhelmed instead of pretending everything is fine. I also started noticing how common this silent breaking point actually is among parents and couples in America. People who look functional on the outside but are quietly stretched thin inside. And nobody really teaches you how to talk about that without feeling like you are failing. Slowly, I began using my slow English reading practice not just as language training but as emotional regulation. Reading out loud softly when I felt overwhelmed, letting my voice slow my thoughts down. Letting simple sentences remind my brain that not everything requires urgency. And over time that small habit became like a reset button for my nervous system. Neuroscience actually supports this idea. Slow controlled reading and breathing can activate parasympathetic responses, reducing stress and helping emotional processing. But in real life it just felt like I was teaching myself how to return to myself after losing direction in noise. That night on the kitchen floor became a strange turning point, not because everything was solved, but because I stopped pretending I did not need support. And in American culture where independence is often valued so highly, admitting emotional struggle can feel uncomfortable, almost like breaking an invisible rule. But I learned something important there. Breaking down is not the opposite of strength. It is often the beginning of rebuilding something more honest. And maybe that is why I remember that kitchen floor so clearly, not as a failure, but as the first time I stopped performing and started actually feeling again. Slow English healed me. There is a strange moment in healing that nobody really warns you about. When you realize you are no longer trying to escape your thoughts but actually learning how to sit with them without panic. And for me that moment did not arrive through therapy sessions, motivational speeches, or dramatic life changes. It arrived very quietly through something as simple as reading English slowly in my kitchen at night while the rest of my house slept in an ordinary American suburb that looked peaceful from the outside but often felt emotionally complicated inside my mind. After the night I broke down, something inside me refused to go back to the same speed I had been living at. My thoughts had been running like they were permanently late for something. Always rushing, always reacting, always trying to fix everything immediately, but my body had started resisting that pace. Almost like it was asking me to slow down, or it would force me to slow down in more painful ways. That is when I began practicing what I now call slow English reading, not as a learning technique at first, but as a survival habit. Something I did not even fully understand but felt strangely drawn to every evening when the house became quiet and I could finally hear my own thoughts again without interruption from dishes, notifications, children, or responsibilities pulling my attention in every direction at once. I would sit at the kitchen table with a simple book, sometimes children's stories, sometimes basic English dialogues, sometimes short emotional passages about daily life in America, and I would read out loud very slowly, not trying to sound perfect, not trying to impress anyone, just trying to stay present with each word like it was something I had to rediscover instead of rush through. At first it felt awkward, almost embarrassing, because my brain kept telling me I was wasting time, that I should be doing something more productive, more efficient. More useful according to the invisible productivity rules I had absorbed from modern life in the United States, where being busy often feels like a personality trait. But something unexpected started happening after a few nights. My breathing began to change before my thoughts did. I would read a sentence slowly, and my body would naturally slow down to match the rhythm of my voice. And for the first time in a long time I felt my nervous system stop behaving like it was in emergency mode. Neuroscience research actually explains this in a very interesting way, when people engage in slow, rhythmic speech or reading. It can activate parts of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for calming the body, lowering heart rate, and reducing stress hormones. But in real life I did not think about science at all. I just noticed that my chest felt less tight and my mind stopped racing quite so aggressively. One night, while reading a very simple paragraph about family life, I suddenly stopped mid-sentence because I realized I was not afraid of speaking anymore in that moment. I was not afraid of making mistakes. I was not afraid of sounding imperfect. I was just reading. And that simplicity felt almost revolutionary compared to how complicated I had made language in my mind. English had once been something that made me anxious, something I associated with mistakes, embarrassment, and social pressure. Especially in public situations in the United States where conversations can happen quickly and unexpectedly. But slow reading turned English into something different, something gentle. Something I could control instead of something that controlled my emotions. The surprising part was that my confidence in real conversations started changing too, not because I practiced speaking aggressively, but because I trained my brain to stop panicking during language use, and once panic decreased, clarity naturally increased. I remember one morning at a grocery store when a cashier asked me a fast question, and for the first time I did not freeze. I simply paused, processed, and responded calmly, and that tiny moment felt bigger than it should have. Like I had just unlocked a version of myself I thought was permanently lost. What I did not realize at the time was that slow English reading was not just improving my language skills, it was retraining my emotional system. Because language and emotion are deeply connected in the brain, and when you change how you experience language, you also change how you experience pressure, fear, and social interaction. In American daily life, where communication can feel fast and direct, I used to interpret speed as pressure. But slowly I began to separate speed from safety, meaning I learned that I did not have to match the pace of others to be understood or respected. That realization alone reduced so much internal tension I had been carrying for years without noticing. Another unexpected change happened inside my home. My children started reacting differently to me without me trying to change anything intentionally. I was speaking more slowly, listening more fully, responding with less emotional reactivity, and somehow that created a calmer environment around us. My husband noticed it too and once said I seemed less tense, which at the time I did not fully understand. Because I did not feel like I had changed anything dramatic, but looking back now I realize I had changed the speed of my internal world. And that changed everything else around me indirectly. Psychologists often describe this as emotional contagion, the idea that emotional states can transfer between people through tone, behavior, and presence, which means when one person becomes calmer, the environment around them can naturally become calmer as well. That concept made me reflect deeply on how much of my past stress was not only personal but also relational, shaped by reactions bouncing back and forth between people without enough pause in between. There was one particular evening I will never forget. I was reading slowly at the kitchen table while rain hit the windows outside in a soft repetitive rhythm. And for the first time I noticed that I was not thinking about tomorrow while reading. I was not mentally planning tasks. I was not emotionally rehearsing arguments. I was simply present with words, and that presence felt unfamiliar but safe at the same time. My husband sat nearby working quietly, and at one point he looked up and said something simple, "You seem more here lately." And I did not respond immediately because I realized he was right in a way I had not noticed myself. I had been physically present in my life for years, but mentally I was often elsewhere, either worrying about the future or replaying the past. And slow English reading was pulling me back into the present moment, one sentence at a time. Over time, I began to understand something very important about healing that nobody had clearly explained to me before. Healing is not always about adding new things to your life. Sometimes it is about slowing down existing things until your nervous system can finally catch up with your reality. That idea completely changed how I approached not only English learning but also motherhood, marriage, and daily stress in America, where life often feels like it is moving slightly faster than emotional recovery allows. I stopped treating every mistake as a crisis. I stopped rushing through conversations. I stopped expecting myself to perform perfectly in real time. Instead, I began focusing on staying calm inside imperfection, and that shift alone made communication easier, relationships softer, and my internal world much less chaotic. Slow English reading did not magically fix my life, but it gave me something I had been missing for a long time. A way to return to myself when everything felt too fast, and that is why I still do it today. Not because I need to learn English anymore, but because it reminds me that peace is something you can practice, one slow sentence at a time. What Americans rarely say. There is a strange silence inside American daily life that nobody really points out directly. Almost like an invisible rule everyone follows without agreeing to it out loud. And I only started noticing it after living here long enough to stop focusing on surviving and start observing patterns in how people actually communicate beneath the surface of normal conversations. On the outside, Americans can appear very open, friendly, even talkative in casual situations like grocery stores, schools, workplaces, or neighborhood gatherings. But underneath that friendliness there is often a deep respect for emotional privacy that changes the way people share thoughts, feelings, and personal struggles, and at first this confused me deeply because I came from a mindset where closeness meant sharing more, talking more, and expressing emotions more directly. One of the first things I noticed was how often people say I'm good even when they are clearly not good. Not in a dishonest way, but in a socially protective way, like emotional boundaries are part of everyday communication etiquette. At first, I took this literally, and I would assume people were truly fine, until I slowly realized that in many American conversations, especially brief ones, I'm good often means I don't want to go deeper right now, not necessarily everything is perfect. That single misunderstanding taught me something important about communication in the United States. That sometimes meaning is carried not in words themselves but in timing, tone, and what is intentionally left unsaid. Another thing that surprised me was how carefully people manage emotional space in conversations. For example, even close friends might hesitate to ask very personal questions too directly unless there is clear emotional permission. Because privacy is often considered a form of respect rather than distance. I remember once during a neighborhood gathering someone asked me how I was doing, and I started giving a detailed answer about stress, parenting, and exhaustion, and I noticed a subtle shift in the conversation energy, not rejection, not judgment. Just a quiet step back as if I had crossed into a deeper emotional zone faster than expected. Later I learned that in American culture, emotional depth is often approached gradually rather than immediately. And people tend to check temperature of conversations before going deeper. That realization helped me understand many situations where I had previously felt confused or even slightly rejected without reason. Another surprising pattern I noticed is how Americans often avoid giving unsolicited advice unless it is clearly requested. Which at first made me feel unsupported during difficult moments because in my previous understanding, caring meant actively offering solutions or guidance. But here, not giving advice unless asked is often a sign of respect, a way of acknowledging that people are capable of handling their own decisions. This difference became very clear in my marriage as well, where early on I would sometimes expect immediate problem solving during emotional conversations, while my husband often focused more on listening first, pausing, and responding gently instead of jumping into solutions. At first I interpreted that pause as emotional distance. But over time I realized it was actually a different communication style rooted in listening before reacting. Psychologists often explain that communication styles across cultures can vary significantly between high context and low context patterns, where some cultures rely heavily on shared emotional understanding and others rely more on explicit verbal clarity and personal boundaries. And the United States often sits in a unique space where direct communication exists alongside strong respect for individual emotional space. Another thing Americans rarely say directly is how tired they actually are. In daily conversations, especially in workplace environments or casual interactions, people often maintain a tone of positivity even when internally overwhelmed, not because they are hiding truth in a deceptive way, but because there is a cultural expectation to maintain functional optimism in public settings. I started noticing this during school events and social gatherings, where parents would casually mention being busy or a little tired, but rarely go into deeper emotional explanations unless speaking with someone they deeply trust. Over time, I realized that exhaustion here is often normalized to the point where people assume everyone else is also tired, so there is less need to emphasize it openly. That normalization created an interesting emotional effect on me because I began questioning whether I was experiencing something abnormal, when in reality I was simply reacting to a shared cultural rhythm of constant activity. Another subtle but powerful thing I learned is that silence in American conversations is not necessarily uncomfortable for everyone, even though it felt uncomfortable for me at first. In some cultures, silence during conversations is filled quickly with additional speech, but here silence can simply mean thinking, processing, or respecting space in communication. I remember one moment sitting with Eleanor, my older neighbor, where we were both drinking tea and there was a long pause between sentences. And instead of filling it with words like I used to, I noticed she remained completely relaxed, as if silence itself was part of the conversation rather than a gap in it. That experience slowly changed how I viewed pauses in communication, especially in English-speaking situations where I used to rush to avoid silence out of fear of awkwardness. One of the most important realizations I had over time was that Americans often separate emotional life into different spaces, meaning work conversations stay in work context, casual conversations stay light, and deep emotional sharing usually happens in trusted environments rather than across all interactions. At first, this felt emotionally segmented to me, but later I began to understand it as a form of emotional structure rather than emotional distance. It allows people to manage energy more intentionally, which can be especially important in a fast-paced society where constant emotional availability would become overwhelming. I also noticed how often Americans use humor as a subtle emotional bridge, even in stressful or uncomfortable situations. Jokes are frequently used not to avoid feelings but to make them easier to carry. At family dinners, in workplaces, even during small mistakes in daily life, humor often appears as a way to soften tension without denying reality. That was something I slowly began adopting myself. Especially during moments of parenting stress where laughter sometimes became the easiest way to reset emotional intensity in the room. Through all these observations, I began to realize that what Americans rarely say is often more important than what they do say. Not because there is secrecy, but because emotional expression here is structured around autonomy, timing, and context. And understanding that structure changed my entire experience of communication in this country. Instead of interpreting silence as rejection or brevity as coldness, I began seeing them as different ways of managing emotional energy. That shift alone reduced so much unnecessary anxiety in my daily life because I stopped personalizing neutral behaviors that were never meant to be personal in the first place. Over time, this understanding also improved my confidence in English because I was no longer overanalyzing every interaction for hidden meaning. I simply listened, observed, and responded more calmly. Slow English reading practice helped here too because it trained my mind to pause instead of react, to interpret language more gently instead of aggressively, and to accept that not everything needs immediate emotional decoding. And maybe the biggest lesson I learned from all of this is that communication is not just about speaking clearly. It is also about learning how different cultures breathe between words, and once you understand that breathing pattern, conversations stop feeling like tests and start feeling like shared human space. Confidence came quietly. If you asked me when exactly I became confident in speaking English, I would probably disappoint you with the answer because there was no single dramatic moment, no sudden transformation scene, no inspirational background music playing while I suddenly understood everything perfectly. Instead, it happened in a way so quiet that I almost did not notice it until much later when I realized I had stopped feeling afraid in situations that used to make my entire body tense up. Confidence, as I learned living in the United States as a mother, wife, and someone constantly navigating both language and culture, does not arrive like a door opening. It arrives more like a window slowly becoming less foggy until you suddenly realize you can see clearly through it without even remembering when the fog started lifting. One of the earliest signs came during a completely ordinary situation, a phone call with my child's school about a small schedule change. Something that in the past would have triggered immediate anxiety because phone conversations in English used to feel like high-pressure performances, where I had no visual cues, no time to think too long, and no safety net to hide behind. That day, I remember holding the phone and feeling something different in my body, not excitement, not perfection, but calm. A kind of steady attention that allowed me to listen, process, and respond without the familiar panic rising in my chest. I made a small mistake during the call. I misheard a detail and had to ask the teacher to repeat it. And instead of spiraling into embarrassment like I would have before, I simply said, "Could you repeat that slowly, please?" And waited without apologizing excessively or mentally attacking myself afterward. That moment felt so small externally that nobody would ever notice it. But internally it felt like standing up after realizing you had been sitting in a cramped position for too long without realizing how uncomfortable you were. Psychologists often explain that confidence is not the absence of anxiety but the ability to function despite it without allowing it to dominate your decisions. and I started to understand that definition not intellectually but physically through repeated everyday experiences like that phone call. Another moment happened at a grocery store checkout line where the cashier asked me a casual question about my weekend plans, something simple. Something friendly, something I would normally overthink and respond too quickly to avoid awkward silence, but this time I paused naturally. Processed the question, and answered slowly without rushing myself. There was no applause, no dramatic recognition, just a normal human interaction, but I walked back to my car feeling strangely different. Not because I had spoken perfectly, but because I had not panicked while speaking imperfectly. That distinction changed everything for me over time. I used to believe confidence meant flawless English, perfect pronunciation, fast responses, and zero mistakes. But living in America slowly taught me that real confidence is actually much quieter. It is the absence of internal punishment after imperfection. And the most surprising part is that once I stopped punishing myself internally, my English actually improved faster. Because my brain was no longer associating speaking with danger. Neuroscience research supports this idea by showing that anxiety activates the amygdala, which can interfere with language retrieval and working memory, meaning the more you panic, the harder it becomes to access words you actually already know. Which explains why many people suddenly forget simple vocabulary under pressure even when they are otherwise fluent. Understanding that helped me stop interpreting my mistakes as evidence of inability and start seeing them as normal cognitive interference caused by stress. Around this time, my slow English reading practice became more consistent and more meaningful. Not just as a learning technique but as a grounding ritual. Every night I would read simple passages slowly, sometimes repeating sentences out loud, sometimes focusing on rhythm rather than speed. And gradually I noticed that my speaking voice during real conversations also started becoming slower, more stable, less reactive. One evening, my husband commented that I sounded more relaxed when you speak now. And I remember being surprised because I had not consciously tried to change my speaking style, it had simply shifted as my nervous system changed. That realization made me understand something very important about confidence. It is not built only through practice of skill, but through regulation of emotional state while using that skill. Another powerful change happened during social situations with other parents at school events, where I used to feel pressure to sound fluent and intelligent in English conversations. But over time I started focusing less on performance and more on connection. Instead of trying to construct perfect sentences, I focused on understanding meaning and responding naturally, even if my grammar was not flawless. And interestingly, people responded more warmly when I stopped trying so hard. It turns out humans respond more to emotional presence than linguistic perfection in most casual interactions. There was also a shift in how I experienced silence during conversations. Earlier in my journey, silence felt like failure, like I had run out of things to say, but later I started seeing silence as processing time. A natural pause where thinking happens, and that changed my entire communication rhythm. I stopped rushing to fill gaps and started allowing conversations to breathe, which made interactions feel more comfortable for both me and the people I spoke with. One particularly memorable moment happened during a parent-teacher meeting where I had to discuss my child's progress in English. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, I found myself actively listening, asking questions calmly, and even joking lightly at one point without worrying about grammar mistakes. After the meeting ended, I walked out feeling something I had not felt in a long time in English-speaking environments. I felt like myself. Not a translated version of myself, not a nervous version of myself, but simply myself using another language as a tool instead of a barrier. That is when I realized confidence had quietly arrived without announcement. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional fireworks. It was simply the absence of fear in places where fear used to live automatically. Over time, I also noticed that this quiet confidence started influencing other areas of my life, especially motherhood and marriage. Because when you stop fearing communication mistakes, you also stop overreacting emotionally in daily misunderstandings. You listen more, respond slower, and assume less. And ironically, that made relationships smoother than when I was trying harder to be perfect. Slow English reading continued playing a key role in this transformation because it trained my mind to accept slowness without judgment, to stay present in imperfect language without stress, and to separate understanding from performance. I stopped measuring my progress by how fast I could speak and started noticing how calm I felt while speaking, and that shift changed everything. Looking back now, I realize confidence did not come from mastering English, it came from befriending discomfort until it stopped feeling like danger. And once discomfort stopped feeling dangerous, everything else became naturally easier. From culture shock to calm strength. There is a strange moment in life when you realize you are no longer the same person who first arrived emotionally confused in a new culture. And for me, that realization did not come in a dramatic celebration or a life-changing announcement. It came on a completely ordinary afternoon in the United States while I was standing in my kitchen listening to my children argue about something meaningless. The kind of argument that sounds serious to them but sounds almost comedic to adults who have survived enough real life to know that socks, toys, and snack choices are rarely worth emotional war. I remember pausing for a second and noticing something unusual inside myself. I was not overwhelmed. I was not panicking. I was not mentally translating everything into stress like I used to. I was simply present, calm, and strangely grounded in a way that felt unfamiliar but peaceful at the same time. That version of me would have been impossible years ago when even small conversations in English could trigger anxiety, self-doubt, and overthinking. But now something had shifted quietly without announcement. Like emotional weather changing without anyone noticing until the sky suddenly looks different. I walked to the window that afternoon and looked outside at a normal American neighborhood, cars passing slowly, neighbors walking dogs, someone carrying grocery bags. Everything looking ordinary on the surface but suddenly feeling deeply meaningful to me in a way I could not fully explain. I thought about the journey from that early version of myself who struggled to speak without fear, who avoided conversations, who overanalyzed every interaction, and I realized something important. I had not just learned English. I had learned how to stop fighting myself while using it. Slow English reading, which began as a simple survival habit, had become something much deeper over time. It became a way to regulate my nervous system, a way to slow down internal panic, and a way to reconnect with myself when life felt too fast or too heavy. I used to believe improvement had to be loud, visible, and dramatic, but this experience taught me that the most powerful changes are often quiet, almost invisible, happening in the background of daily life while you are busy living it. Even now, I still remember those nights sitting at the kitchen table reading simple English passages out loud, sometimes stumbling, sometimes repeating words, sometimes stopping just to breathe and continue again, and at the time it felt small, almost insignificant. But those small moments slowly rewired the way my brain responded to language, pressure, and emotional discomfort. Neuroscience research often explains that repetition in a calm state strengthens neural pathways associated with memory and language processing. But what that really meant in my real life was simple: the calmer I became while practicing English, the less my brain treated English as a threat and the more it treated it as a normal part of communication. Over time, that shift changed everything, not just my speaking ability but my entire emotional experience inside conversations. I started noticing that I was no longer bracing for embarrassment before speaking. I was no longer anticipating mistakes as disasters. And I was no longer measuring my worth based on how perfectly I could express myself in a second language. Instead, I began focusing on something much more human: connection, understanding, presence. One of the most surprising outcomes of this journey was how it affected my relationships at home. My marriage felt less tense, not because problems disappeared, but because communication became softer, slower, and less reactive. My children also responded differently because I was no longer carrying the same level of internal stress into everyday interactions. Even simple moments like dinner conversations or morning routines felt lighter, not because life became easier, but because I stopped amplifying difficulty inside my mind. I remember one evening sitting with my husband after dinner, and instead of discussing tasks or problems, we simply talked about our day slowly, without urgency, without pressure, and at one point he said something very simple that stayed with me. He said, "You seem more peaceful lately." And I realized he was right, but not because something external had changed, but because something internal had finally stopped resisting everything all the time. That resistance had been exhausting me for years without me fully realizing it. Living in the United States taught me many cultural lessons, but the most important one was not about language or lifestyle. It was about emotional pacing. Life here can feel fast, structured, and highly functional. But beneath that surface there is also space for calmness if you learn how to slow your internal reactions instead of constantly matching external speed. That is where slow English reading became more than a practice; it became a philosophy for living. A reminder that I do not have to rush through understanding, I do not have to force immediate confidence, and I do not have to interpret discomfort as failure. Instead, I learned to sit with discomfort until it softened naturally on its own. There were still difficult days, of course, days when I felt tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally stretched. Because life does not suddenly become perfect after learning a lesson, but the difference now was how I responded to those days. Instead of collapsing into self-criticism, I slowed down, breathed, and returned to simple practices that grounded me, like reading slowly, speaking gently, and allowing myself to be imperfect without punishment. Looking back at the full journey from culture shock to calm strength, I realized the transformation was never about becoming a different person. It was about returning to a more natural version of myself that existed beneath fear, stress, and constant self-judgment. And maybe that is the real message I want to share through this story. Not that life in a new culture becomes easy. Not that language barriers disappear overnight, but that growth often happens quietly in the moments you choose to slow down instead of speed up, to breathe instead of panic, and to stay present instead of escaping into fear. If there is one thing I hope stays with anyone watching this, it is that discomfort is not your enemy. It is often just the beginning of understanding yourself in a deeper way, and sometimes all it takes is one slow sentence at a time to start changing everything. And if you're still here with me, I want to leave you with one last quiet question, not the kind you answer with your mind, but the kind your life slowly answers over time. How many times have you called yourself not good enough just because you couldn't speak fast, think fast, or perform perfectly in another language, or in life at all? Because here is the truth I had to learn the hard way in the middle of American daily chaos: broken English moments, awkward silences, and emotional breakdowns I never planned for. Confidence was never about becoming flawless. It was about stopping the war you keep fighting inside your own head every time you make a mistake. The moment I stopped punishing myself for being slow, imperfect, or unsure, something strange happened. My English didn't just improve, my entire life started feeling lighter. Softer. More human. And maybe that is the part nobody tells you about learning anything in life. Especially English in real-world situations like in the United States today in 2026. You don't just learn words, you learn how to stop shrinking yourself while speaking them. So if you are practicing slow English reading with me, don't rush your progress. Don't chase perfection. Don't wait until you feel ready, because readiness is often just fear wearing a nice outfit. Start exactly where you are, with your imperfect voice, your uncertain grammar, your nervous thoughts, and stay with it a little longer than your fear wants you to. That is where real transformation quietly begins. And I promise you, one day you will look back and realize you were never bad at English, you were just learning how to feel safe while using it. If this story touched something inside you, don't let it disappear when the video ends. Subscribe to this channel, because here we don't just learn English, we slow life down enough to actually understand it. Share this video with someone who feels stuck, tired, or afraid to speak, because they might not need more pressure, they might just need permission to slow down. And now I'll leave you with this thought: what if your next level in English is not faster speech, but calmer breath? See you in the next story.